What is going on, my fellow nerds? Operator Otter here, and today we are going to round out our bone-based builds for Season 4 of the Necromancer with our first S-Tier build, and that's going to be Bone Spirit. Yeah, Bone Spirit. The build that went totally under the radar for the entire PTR because it was so overshadowed by the Flavor of the Month builds being Minion Necromancer and the Ebon Piercer Necromancer, utilizing that lucky hit chance shenanigan crap. But make no mistake, this build is dominating everything in the game, especially the pits. And to explain a little bit more what's going underneath the hood with the mechanics of Bone Spirit, I'm actually going to bring on my brother-in-arms and co-theory crafter, Sirke, who actually peer reviews all of the builds that I actually put up on the YouTube channel. So like 50% of the quality is really coming from this guy right here. So make sure to lend him an ear, give him a shout out, make sure you listen, and we'll take it from there. So Sirke, take it away.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity to talk about my favorite build. So, Bone Spirit's a build that I've played since Season 1, and it's something that I've always come back to time and time again, no matter how good or bad it was. And in Season 4, this build is just extremely strong. On the PTR, I was able to consistently hit 70 million Bone Spirit hits twice a second on a 0-second cooldown. But with more optimized gear, I could easily see it hitting over 100 million damage each. Like, easily. And the main reason this is possible is thanks to the new temperings we got, being Bone Critical Strike Chance and Macabre Skills Grant Essence. Now, the cool thing about the Macabre Tempers is that they actually restore your essence before Bone Spirit consumes your essence, meaning you're able to cast near max essence Bone Spirits at machine gun speeds. Because of this, though, we no longer need to run Dreadful Bone Spirit because our mana is just solved. Because we get so much essence every single time that we cast it, having to wait 4 seconds just doesn't matter anymore. And instead, we can run Ghastly Bone Spirit, which gives us 10% critical strike chance to Bone Spirit. This, in combination with the critical strike tempers I mentioned before, allow us to no longer need Aspect of Swelling Curse, which is something that we relied on a lot before to prop up our crit rate. And without it, we can run things like Conceited Aspect, which is going to boost our damage so much compared to Season 3. Now, the reason why critical strike chance is so important is due to enhanced Bone Spirit. It lowers the cooldown of Bone Spirit by 7 seconds whenever you critically strike with it. Between this, our cooldown reduction, and our rapid ossification, it brings down the cooldown of Bone Spirit to 0 seconds, meaning the only limiting factor in how fast you can machine gun these out is your attack speed, because it lowers the cast time animation of the ability. So the main priority of the build is getting to 100% crit rate to consistently refresh its cooldown as much as possible. And a big part of how we're doing that is Bone Storm, which is granting us 20% critical strike chance. But what you'll notice is we aren't running Lidless Wall, we're not running Flicker Step, and we're not running Osseous Scale, which are the normal ways people maintain 100% uptime on Bone Storm. So how are we achieving this? Well, the answer is actually in our temperings. In the amulet, we have Ranked Rapid Ossification, and in our weapon, we have Bone Storm Duration. With these two together, we're able to maintain 100% uptime on our Bone Storm, because Rapid Ossification is refunding so much cooldown from our just constantly casting Bone Spirit that every single time you cast it, you're getting 2 seconds off your Bone Storm. And when you're casting 12, 15 Bone Storms or Bone Spirits inside of a Bone Storm duration, it pretty much refunds the entire thing. And it's not just giving us crit rate. It's also one of the best defensive aspects in the game, or defensive abilities in the game, especially when combined with Aspect of Shielding Storm and Aspect of Ultimate Shadow. Now, the last one might sound weird, but it's something that we learned in Abattoir of Zur was just how strong it was. It's one of the strongest defensive aspects for the Necromancer because it's able to add a damage over time to your Bone Storm, which triples the effectiveness of Shielding Storm's barrier generation. This is especially strong when you're backed up by capped resistances and armor, which I know the builder says I'm not capped on resistances, but it's not taking into account the Book of the Dead getting multiplied by Memento Mori, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. One of the things we're also focusing very heavily on is barrier generation. Because we have such a huge synergy point between Aspect of Ultimate Shadow and Shielding Storm, it makes barrier generation as a substat incredibly strong. So we're focusing very, very heavily on that. Now, this is the main concept of the build, but if you want to push this damage even further, there's a concept known as sweet spotting, which I have a replay of here. So you'll notice when I go into this, when I cast Bone Storm, or when I cast Bone Spirits, you're not going to see any splinters come out until after the boss is dead, and this is what sweet spotting is. So you see here, I cast Bone Storm, or Bone Spirit, and you'll see my mana is going to full every single time. Now, how are we doing this? That's called sweet spotting. So we made a little diagram here. So the way sweet spotting works is Aspect of Shattered Spirit will send out 18 little bone shards out, and each one of those grant you 6 essence. Now, the hitbox on those little shards extends farther than it looks. So when you overlay your hitbox on top of the boss, like you saw in that replay, it makes all 18 of them hit the boss. So when our Macabre tempers go off, that gets us about 80% of our mana, and then the sweet spot gets us all the way back up. And frankly, even if we didn't have the tempers, Shattered Spirit is enough mana to get you through it, but obviously we run the Macabre skills because you really can't sweet spot all the time in pits because bosses move, sometimes you have to dodge mechanics, but knowing how and when to do this is a very critical point of being able to min-max this build. If you're able to get in a situation where you can sweet spot for even just a few seconds, you are going to melt whatever you're hitting. Now, moving on from that, we have some smaller specifics of the build that I want to go over. The first being Metamorphosis and the evade, attack slower evade cooldowns. So and you combo this with Tybalt's Will. So Metamorphosis is going to get you 100% uptime on Tybalt's Will. You just get to play around with this massive modifier. You get to have lots of essence. It feels really, really good. And attacks lower cooldown works with your main combo. You can Decrepify, you can Bone Spirit, you can dash, you Decrepify, you Bone Spirit, you dash, and it's just a very fluid motion, and it lets you move through the dungeon very, very, very quickly. That's one of the main points of the speedrunning build, because in the speedrunning version of the build, we make a few changes. We end up running in our amulets Ghostwalker, because this build does so much damage that like you can run a non-offensive aspect in your amulet, and you just get maxed movement speed, and you just move through every single unit, which also sets up sweet spotting versus bosses, because you can just walk into the boss's hitbox and set up a sweet spot for free. This is by far the best way to do it. Now, because we aren't running a lot of things that we were before, we get to run things like Osseous Gale. And Osseous Gale, the reason why we don't run it in pits is because taking the corpse away from the boss means you don't get Tendrils uptime on the boss. And in T100s, that really doesn't matter. You're killing the boss before that ever matters. But in pits, you really need that repeated Tendrils uptime for the repeated vulnerable, right? So this is something that we get to get away with in T100s, which feels really good. And because we also don't need to run Bone Storm duration because we're getting it off of our Osseous Scale, we get to fully utilize Bone Spirit size. And this feels incredible when you're going through easier content and you can just blast an entire room all at once. It is fantastic. But back to the pits build, because this is kind of like the main build, right? One thing that we're also doing is we're focusing very heavily on max HP rolls. You can see it in our weapon, you can see it in our rings. We run it pretty much everywhere. And the reason why we're choosing max HP over something like crit damage, which can roll in the rings in the 2H instead, is because this build does so much damage that it's better to run max HP and just have that little bit more survivability, get that bit more extra HP, so that way you can run through more fearlessly and just kind of coast on through. The extra damage hardly ever comes up, but being able to min-max for more survivability comes at pretty much no cost. Now, if you're looking at this build, one thing you'll notice is we're only running Shaco. we're not running all the other uniques. You could run Ring of Starlit Skies, you can run Melded Heart of Sillage, but they're kind of just bad. And the main reason for that, even though they sound great on paper, is you can't temper them. And this build really relies on its resource tempers. If you run Ring of Starlit Skies and you no longer get the Macabre skill tempers, you just lose out on all of your mana. And you lose out on your crit rate. And if you run the Amulet, you just don't get Bone Storm uptime. These uniques definitely can work, and they might have a place for like T100 pushing, but when it comes to like pits and really trying to min-max the build, Shaco's really the only uber unique you need. It's the only unique in general that you need. I would not really recommend any of those uniques for the build. I think Shaco's pretty much the only one that you really need. And the last thing I want to touch on is the Book of the Dead. So Bone Spirit has a very interesting relationship to maximum mana. If you're running this build and you have 15 extra mana, the only time that 15 extra mana matters is when you're full mana. Because if you're casting Bone Spirit at like 80% mana, that extra 15 doesn't do anything for you. It does come up versus the boss when you get the sweet spot because you are getting max mana there, but you're not getting it through the dungeon, and you're not getting it in situations where you can't get the sweet spot because some bosses just are horrible to sweet spot against, and sometimes you just can't get the sweet spot because you're dodging the echo mechanics. So the vulnerable ends up being a much more consistent modifier to play with, which is a little bit counterintuitive because you're used to bone builds just stacking maximum essence and feeling good about it, but Bone Spirit's not really the kind of build that really wants to be doing that. But yeah, that's kind of all I really had for the build. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll be answering any questions about the builds you guys have in the comments. But in the meantime, back to Otter.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kay. Man, is the guy smart. Knows what he's talking about. He very thoroughly tested it. And this, I watched it in action. And even with an unoptimized build, he was able to actually give me a run for my money on my optimized Ebon Piercer build. It was pretty insane what he was able to achieve. So make sure this does not fly under your radar. If you are a bone enthusiast and you really want to have some fun with these nuclear Bone Spirit explosions and just fly through the content, this might be the build that you want to try. So stay tuned, because when we do cover the Necromancer minion content, Sir K is going to come back covering pretty much all of the minion builds, because he is a huge minion enthusiast as well and knows everything about minions, much better than I do, because I don't like minions, and I know that's heresy to say about Necromancer, but I'm not a fan of them right now, and I have my reasons for that, but that's just the way it is. So if you liked this content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. Stay tuned. Remember, I will be going live on Twitch for the Season 4 release, so please come in and support me in that. Hope to see you there. Other than that, have yourselves a wonderful day. Operator Otter, out.